The medieval kings of England were notorious for their quarrelling over claims to land, for kingdoms, but one king's claim would begin a war which lasted 100 years. This is the history of Edward III. Edward was born at Windsor Castle on the 13th of November 1312, the firstborn child to Edward II and Isabella of France. The reign of his father Edward II was a particularly problematic period of English history, as he was considered a feeble king. One source of contention was that the king's inactivity and repeated failure in the ongoing war with Scotland. Another controversial issue was the king's exclusive patronage of a small group of royal favourites. The birth of a male heir in 1312 temporarily improved Edward II's position in relation to the baronial opposition. To bolster further the independence prestige of the young prince, the king had him created Earl of Chester at only 12 days old. In 1325, Edward II was faced with a demand from his brother-in-law, Charles IV of France, to perform homage for the English Duchy of Aquitaine. Edward was reluctant to leave the country, as discontent was once again brewing domestically, particularly over his relationship with his favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Instead, he had his son Edward created Duke of Aquitaine in his place and sent him to France to perform the homage. The young Edward was accompanied by his mother Isabella, who was the sister of King Charles, and was meant to negotiate a peace treaty with the French. While in France, Isabella conspired with the exiled Roger Mortimer to have Edward deposed. To build up diplomatic and military support for the venture, Isabella had her son engaged to the 12-year-old Philippa of Hainault. An invasion of England was launched, and Edward II's forces deserted him completely. Isabella and Mortimer summoned a parliament, and the king was forced to relinquish the throne to his son, who was proclaimed king in London on the 25th of January 1327. The new king was crowned as Edward III at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of February at the age of just 14. It was not long before the new reign also met with other problems caused by the central position at court of Mortimer, who was now the de facto ruler of England. Mortimer used his power to acquire noble estates and titles, and his unpopularity grew with the humiliating defeat by the Scots at the Battle of Stanhope Park and the ensuing Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed with the Scots in 1328. Also, the young king came into conflict with his guardian. Mortimer knew his position in relation to the king was precarious and subjected Edward to disrespect. The tension increased after Edward and Philippa, who had married at York Minster on the 24th of January 1328, had a son, Edward of Woodstock, on the 15th of June 1330. Eventually, the king decided to take direct action against Mortimer. Aided by his close companion William Montague, 3rd Baron Montague, and a small number of other trusted men, Edward took Mortimer by surprise at Nottingham Castle on the 19th of October 1330. Mortimer was executed, and Edward III's personal reign began. Edward III was not content with the peace agreement made in his name, but the renewal of the war with Scotland originated in private, rather than royal initiative. A group of English barons, known as the Disinherited, who had lost land in Scotland by the peace treaty, staged an invasion of Scotland and won a great victory at the Battle of Duplin Moor in 1332. They attempted to install Edward Balliol as King of Scotland in place of the infant David II, but Balliol was soon expelled and was forced to seek help of Edward III. The English king responded by laying siege to the important border town of Berwick and defeated a large relieving army at the Battle of Halidon Hill. In 1337, Philip VI of France confiscated the English Duchy of Aquitaine and the county of Pontefract. Instead of seeking a peaceful resolution to the conflict by paying homage to the French king, as his father had done, Edward responded by laying claim to the French crown as the grandson of Philip IV. The French rejected this based on the precedents for agnatic succession set in 1316 and 1322. Instead, they upheld the rights of Philip IV's nephew king, Philip VI, thereby setting the stage for the 100 Years' War. In the early stages of the war, Edward's strategy was to build alliances with other continental rulers. In 1338, Louis IV, Holy Roman Emperor, named Edward Vicar General of the Holy Roman Empire and promised his support. As late as 1373, the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1373 established an Anglo-Portuguese alliance. These measures produced few results. The only major military victory in this phase of the war was the English Navy victory at Sluys on 24th of June 1340, which secured its control of the English Channel. Meanwhile, the fiscal pressure on the kingdom caused by Edward's expensive alliances led to discontent at home. The Regency Council at home was frustrated by the mounting national debt, while the king and his commanders on the continent were angered by the failure of the government in England to provide sufficient funds. To deal with the situation, Edward himself returned to England, arriving in London unannounced on the 30th of November 1340. Finding the affairs of the realm in disorder, he purged the royal administration of a great number of ministers and judges. By the early 1340s, it was clear that Edward's policy of alliances was too costly and yielded too few results. The following years saw more direct involvement by English armies, including in the Breton War of Succession, but these interventions also proved fruitless at first. Edward defaulted on a Florentine loan of over 1 million florins, resulting in the ruin of the lenders. A major change came in July 1346, when Edward staged a major offensive, sailing for Normandy with a force of 15,000 men. His army sacked the city of Caen and marched across northern France to meet up with the French forces in Flanders. It was not Edward's initial intention to engage the French army, but at Crécy, just north of the Somme, he found favourable terrain and decided to fight a pursuing army led by Philip VI. On the 26th of August, the English army defeated a far larger French army in the Battle of Crécy. Shortly after this, on the 17th of October, an English army defeated and captured David II of Scotland at the Battle of Neville's Cross. With his northern borders secured, Edward felt free to continue his major offensive against the French, laying siege to the town of Calais. The operation was the greatest English venture of the 100 Years' War, involving an army of 35,000 men. The siege started on the 4th of September 1346 and lasted until the town surrendered on the 3rd of August 1347. After the fall of Calais, factors outside Edward's control forced him to wind down the war effort. In 1348, the Black Death struck England with full force, killing a third or more of the population. This loss of manpower led to a shortage of farm labour and a corresponding rise in wages. The great landowners struggled with the shortage of manpower and the resulting inflation in labour costs. To curb the rise in wages, the King and Parliament responded with the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statutes of Labourers in 1351. These attempts to regulate wages could not succeed in the long run, but in the short term they were enforced with great vigour. However, the plague did not lead to a full-scale breakdown of government and society, and recovery was remarkably swift. It was not until the mid-1350s that military operations on the continent were resumed on a large scale. In 1356, Edward's eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, won an important victory in the Battle of Poitiers. The greatly outnumbered English forces not only routed the French, but captured the French King John II and his youngest son, Philip. After a succession of victories, the English held great positions in France. The French king was in English custody, and the French central government had almost totally collapsed. In 1360, therefore, Edward accepted the Treaty of Bretigny, whereby he renounced the claims to the French throne, but secured his extended French possessions in full sovereignty. Edward not only secured more land in France, but expanded the ranks of peerage by introducing the new title of Duke for close relatives of the king. Furthermore, he bolstered the sense of community within this group by the creation of the Order of the Garter, probably in 1348. A plan from 1344 to revive the Round Table of King Arthur never came to fruition, but the new order carried references from this legend by the circular shape of the Garter. While Edward's early reign had been energetic and successful, his later years were marked by inaction, military failure and political strife. The day-to-day affairs of the state had less appeal to Edward than military campaigning, so during the 1360s, Edward increasingly relied on help of his subordinates, and relied on his sons for the leadership of military operations. By 1369, the French war started anew, and Edward's son John of Gaunt was given the responsibility of a military campaign. The effort failed, and with the Treaty of Bruges in 1375, the great English possessions in France were reduced to only the coastal towns of Calais, Bordeaux and Bayonne. Military failure abroad and the associated fiscal pressure of constant campaigns led to political discontent at home. The problem came to a head in the Parliament of 1376, the so-called Good Parliament. This Parliament was called to grant taxation, but the House of Commons took the opportunity to address certain grievances. In particular, criticism was directed at some of the King's closest advisers. Lord Chamberlain William Latimer, 4th Baron Latimer, and Steward of the Household John Neville, 3rd Baron Neville of de Raby, were dismissed from their positions. Edward's mistress, Alice Pierres, was seen to hold far too much power over the ageing king, and was banished from court. Yet the real adversary of the Commons, supported by powerful men such as Edmund Mortimer, 3rd Earl of March, was John of Gaunt. Both the king and Edward of Woodstock were at this time incapacitated by illness, leaving Gaunt in virtual control of government. Around the 29th September 1376, Edward fell ill with a large abscess. After a brief period of recovery, in February 1377, the king died of a stroke at Sheen on the 21st of June. He outlived his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, and the throne passed to his grandson, Richard II. Edward III was in many ways a conventional king, whose main interest was warfare, admired in his own time and for centuries after. But he was denounced as an irresponsible adventurer by later historians. But modern historians credit him with some significant achievements, and Edward has gone down in history as one of England's greatest kings.